Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with modern-day New York City jazz pianist Andy Milne. He delved into his latest 2018 CD, The Seasons of Being, that showcases a 10-piece ensemble featuring Dapp Theory. He's a former student of Oscar Peterson and was the center of the M-Bass Collective as a core member of saxophonist Steve Coleman's bands, as well as performing with Cassandra and Greg Osby. He's a fearless, versatile explorer, pianist, and composer with a distinct and respected voice at the heart of New York's creative scene for over 20 years, collaborating with dancers, visual artists, poets, and musicians spanning jazz, classic, pop, folk, and world music. So get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Andy, thanks for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz, man. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So let's talk about your latest CD with Dapp Theory, The Seasons of Being. There's a lot of animals on it. It sounds like a narrative on this 10-track album. Talk to me about how you constructed this and kind of the artistic forces that went into this project.
Well, I mean, it's sort of an involved kind of backstory in a way, because, and I didn't mean to pun there, but I had a lot of problems with my lower back. Cutting to the chase, one of the ways in which I sort of sought relief was through homeopathic healing, and in the process of doing that, I started thinking about parallels. A homeopath kind of understands a human and their physical, emotional well-being and state of being, and how I might look at musicians and look at just the process for composition, for improvisation, using those same techniques or similar techniques. I mean, I'm not a homeopath, and it kind of intersects with a place where, when I'm years ago, I brought an arrangement in, and one of the musicians said, I said, well, I've got a section here, I want you to solo in this section, and he says, I'm not really feeling it. And I thought, why are you being so difficult? Are you being difficult? I thought this would be perfect for you. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, geez, I've been on gigs where someone has said, hey, do you want to take a solo here? And I frankly didn't want to. But my professionalism led me to sort of saying yes, because, sometimes you just do what the leader needs you to do. But I thought, well, I wonder if there's something similar to why I didn't want to do this that was based on some other purpose, other sort of background other than just I wasn't in the mood. Like what? That's sort of a short stop. So I started thinking about it from the point of view of homeopathy and how a homeopath kind of understands a person. And so I decided I wanted to write music that I could kind of optimize the context for each improviser based upon sort of studying them and understanding their emotional lineage. So you asked a fairly weighted question without maybe realizing it, but that was the background to wanting to construct the music for this recording, and kind of how I began investigating writing the music.
Are you happy with how it turned out?
Yes. It involved studying each person and taking information about them that they were comfortable giving me, but in a way that they wouldn't necessarily realize they were revealing, huge swaths of their inner sort of secrets. But I mean, these are individuals that I know in many cases very well personally and certainly professionally, and so the information that I got was kind of revealing, even though I know them well. But then I took that information and I used it with the consultation with a homeopath to understand them in a deeper kind of different way, and then I wrote to sort of match those pathologies that were kind of revealed.
With this album, it's obviously a personal testimony, and so is most music. And my question is this: you've had 9+ albums as a lead sideman, but I want to kind of focus in on your leader work and ask you, do you see each album as kind of a stamp of where you're at in time, or a successive vision of your evolution or your journey as an artist with your artistic vision? How do you see those?
Well, I mean, there's sort of a micro universe, because, each album is definitely a reflection of where I'm at in an artistic journey. Sometimes that journey might seemingly have, a longer arc in terms of points of connectivity, but mostly it's kind of a reflection of what my interests are at, or what my development is sort of bringing me to want to share at that point in time. More so than, say, a longer arc that I'm, masterminding from like point A to sort of point Z. but certainly from the point of view of like, you know, in this case, like this recording, it's very much a reflection of what where I've been at, you know, personally and artistically.
Let's go back to the beginnings of your life. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, and I was raised in a small town called Kincardine, but mostly in Toronto, Ontario, and I lived there until I was in my mid-20s, at which point I moved to Montreal, and then I moved to New York.
Cool. So how did you get into music in the beginning, and what kind of jazz really pulled you into that world?
Everybody in my family took piano lessons, and so I started taking piano lessons when I was about 7, and I was studying classical piano. And around that time, my brother-in-law, who just sort of was the first person to kind of expose me to other forms of music, and he bought me a few recordings. And, you know, it was like Oscar Peterson, who, of course, growing up as a young kid in Canada, you kind of can't miss from the point of view of jazz. So some of my early recordings were Oscar, Duke Ellington, Les McCann, and Eddie Harris. I remember he gave me that Swiss Movement recording when I was quite young. So I started getting exposed to a little bit of jazz thanks to my brother-in-law, and then, you know, slowly but surely was seeking out teachers that could kind of help me, you know, contextualize and demystify, because I wasn't really sure what to do other than just play along with records.
So talk to me about some of those teachers and mentors in your life that really kind of opened up the gates of music to you and helped you understand it.
The first couple of really big, you know, impactive teachers I had were when I was in university in Toronto at York University, and I was studying with a gentleman by the name of John Gittins, who was, you know, a great jazz theorist and also a sociologist at the same time. I took lots of courses with John and learned a lot from him in music and in social science. And then the other big one I had in university was a saxophonist composer named David Mott, who is an American that's lived in Canada for probably since the late 60s, early 70s. And he was a fantastic composer, but really was a, you know, exponent of the proponent, I should say, of I don't want to call it avant-garde, but I'll say freer structures than what maybe people align with in more straight-ahead circles. Just an adventurous and really welcoming spirit, and so he was very supportive and encouraging all through my younger, you know, period there when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do, and then even later on as I sort of kind of sought him out for support and guidance. And then before, you know, getting ready to move to New York, and around the time I was moving to New York, Steve Coleman became a big mentor for me, because I met him and at a time where I was just ripe for another perspective. You know, I ended up working in his band for about a decade, and made, you know, several recordings, and really kind of helped bring my name to people's awareness in the, you know, globally, and sort of shaped a lot of things in terms of how I was able to sort of set the bar pretty high for myself conceptually. So Steve was certainly a huge influence, and then Muhal Richard Abrams, who we unfortunately, you know, lost just a year ago, was also a really massive mentor for me when I moved to New York. Didn't spend tons of time with Muhal, but all the time I did spend with him and conversations we had on the phone were always very meaningful and again, just very supportive and eye-opening. So I have, you know, the fortune of those kinds of musical mentorships in my life that have, I guess, made it, you know, kind of a pretty strong imprint on how I teach and how I mentor, because that's a big part of my life too, and I can't, you know, go through a day without recognizing the sort of weight and impact of some of these individuals. There's a certain kind of acceptance of the struggle that certainly with Muhal, I remember having conversations with Muhal that really helped me contextualize the struggle.
It seems as though things have worked out pretty well. 20-plus years in New York, and your art goes into so many different realms, from dancers to visual artists to poets, musicians. And, in that music realm, you got classic, pop, folk, and world music. My question is this. Obviously, things have worked out with you coming to New York, but in the beginning, what was it like to be kind of in this cauldron of creative, kind of the apex of creativity, I would say, in the world, and getting yourself established? What was that like?
I think back to, kind of being an incubator of creativity and just sort of experimentation. It was great to sort of witness, because you sort of don't realize that when you're in school necessarily that that's what it's going to be, and you see it around you, but you don't understand it from the point of view of I guess, a real life demands. And so I think that was really rewarding. Certainly being in Steve's groups and in different iterations that he had when I was traveling with him and recording with him, and sort of but just not only with Steve, but with other artists that I was working with over the, especially in the 90s when I was doing mostly sideman work, and had fewer opportunities to explore my own ideas. I had groups, but they were not the main focus of my output, and sort of not either with my own participation or going to see rehearsals or see performances of colleagues that were doing similar things and other mentors, that you kind of realize how a lifelong and vast commitment it is to embark upon a life in music and being a creative artist, and not to be taken lightly. And so that was really a huge imprint, because it sort of set the bar pretty high, and I found that was an immediate life lesson that I was kind of resonating for me, because it was something it wasn't like, oh God, you got to work hard. I recognized that, okay, yeah, that there's, and also, but sometimes I think because when you're around people with a really strong vision, it's quite intimidating, because you're both inspired by it, but you're also kind of like, they're setting the bar really high. And so when you get into the part of your life where you start working out your ideas, you've got the sort of vapors left of what you witnessed as a younger person, trying to sort of reach those heights, not necessarily in terms of the content, but in terms of the intensity, at least, and the sophistication that might be brought to your output, and how committed you want to be to that. And that was that still resonates, or still, I wouldn't say it haunts me, but it's still sort of, I feel like it still comes out, or it's certainly in my private moments, I still think about it from the point of view of how am I measuring up to what my mentors would have expected of me, or what they would have imprinted on me in terms of how I should expect myself to strive for, the moon.
So the one thing that you did in '98 was formed the quintet Dapp Theory, and you've been around obviously for a long time on this latest album that featured. Tell me about this group and how it's kind of manifested over time.
Working with the spoken word poet Kokai from D.C. and when I was playing in Metrics, Steve Coleman, and I just really liked what he did, and it was exciting to kind of sort of try using the human voice compositionally, but in this more charged way than the ways I've been using in the past, because I've been using singers, mostly wordless vocals, some things with lyrics, but it was kind of a different direction, and I've been really kind of immersed in this world with working with Kokai a lot. So I asked him to join the band. Well, I just was reconstituting the band at that point anyway. He joined the band, and then very quickly, and somewhere in there, my friend Sean Rickman, who was helping me produce a record, suggested that I could check out this fabulous young harmonica player named Gregoire Marais. And so I asked Gregoire if I think Sean probably asked Gregoire if he wanted to come down to D.C. where we were making this record and play on a couple tunes. And so it kind of went from like playing on a couple tunes to like almost the whole record. He was just so super enthusiastic, and he played great. And he was like, he just wanted to be part of everything. So I said, well, maybe I'll just, bring him into the mix. And so, just sort of brought him into the mix and made him part of the band. Even though it wasn't really practical in those days to travel with 4 people, let alone 5. So, because we were just kind of getting going with the touring. So that became the band with Gregoire and Kokai, and the drummer at the time, Mark Prince, and the bass player in the band, Rich Brown, who was from Canada, who I knew on trips that I'd gone back to visit family and do gigs with other bands. So that was sort of the unit, and then I kind of returned to having a vocalist, like a sort of conventional sung vocals in the band at one point in that early period when I actually had 6 people going on the road with vocalist Vinia Mojica, who was probably her biggest, sort of more infamous sort of recordings that people would know were some of the things she did with Tribe Called Quest. And so she was in the band at one point in the late 90s, and then so ended up having a pretty large ensemble for a minute, but then quickly kind of returned to the quintet format, which I kind of maintained pretty consistently, with the exception of kind of this new recording, really, because it's the quintet that is augmented with 5 guests. But in between, the ensuing additions of the band has always been, a quintet. I eventually, when Gregoire got too busy and was getting opportunities from folks like Pat Metheny, I had to find somebody else because he wasn't going to be able to stay in the band. So then I shifted to saxophone, mainly soprano saxophone, because that was sort of in the same kind of range that I've been accustomed to writing for harmonica. So it sort of evolved through a couple different saxophonists, and the saxophonist that's in the band now, Aaron Krasicki, I mean, he plays a lot of different woodwind instruments, so it's been an interesting evolution where it's, now he hardly plays saxophone, he plays a lot of clarinet, bass clarinet, and duduk, and so the shift has happened gradually as each person has sort of joined the band. They've brought something new, and they've brought something at least new for the band, and so I've just been eager to embrace that and write for it, and then it's, as a result, the sort of the shift, the band has shifted because of the abilities and contributions of these new members, so now there's some resemblance, but it's definitely changed, in 20 years.
Well, the one thing, too, that's interesting about your life and music is that you struck up a relationship with William Shatner in 2011 for his documentary, The Captains, and you've been a part of the themed Star Trek films. Talk to me about that relationship.
Yeah, that was funny how that came about, because it was through Avery Brooks, the actor and musician who I've had a relationship with for a very long time. And when Shatner was doing the first documentary that he was doing about the people that succeeded him in captain's roles in the Star Trek franchise, he needed a composer, and the conversations that Shatner and Avery Brooks were having were largely improvisational around music, and that sort of led to the idea of having a score that would be improvised. And Avery said to Shatner, "I've got the guy for you," and he was referring to me. So Avery called me and said, would you be interested in doing this score for Mr. Shatner? I said, sure. And then I didn't hear about it for about a year. And then he called again and said, okay, I think it's going to happen. And then a couple of days later, I was, having a conference call with the producers and with Shatner on the line, and basically they were moving quickly, and so within a couple of weeks, we'd figured everything out where we were going to do this, and I flew out to LA, and the film wasn't quite finished, but we had enough that I could sort of demonstrate why improvising can work and why improvising can't work at the same time. And so some of the film, needed to be edited and revised before the music could really be put in place, but it was close. But through that, working, diligently for what was a pretty short time. I mean, I composed and recorded the music for the first film in about maybe 2 days.
Wow.
And then had to mix it and then deal with edits and whatnot. But But from that experience, then Shatner had me on board for 6 or 7 other films that he did after that were kind of in the same sort of like additional chapters from the original film, The Captains, where each actor had their own documentary after that. So I did the music for those. It was kind of a very rewarding experience because I was a Star Trek fan, and it was fun to be able to be part of a project that was kind of documenting the connectivity of the various actors and their lives and their work, and sort of having to give personality to each person, each character, each actor through the music that was much different for each film.
The other thing about life and about learning and growing as a musician, and even as a person, is seeing live music. What live jazz shows have you witnessed, especially in the early years, that really were formative and big for you, that you enjoyed?
Oh, I think early years. I mean, I guess everything seems early now. I was telling a student of mine just the other day about a concert I saw with Max Roach and Cecil Taylor. This is like in the early '90s. They were playing outside of Columbia University, and I remember very distinctly how Cecil played for 45 minutes, Max played for 45 minutes, and they played another hour together. And it was fascinating to witness this level of compositional ingenuity. With this through line. It's like there's nothing really got repeated, but not in a wasteful, gratuitous way. It was very thoughtful in terms of hearing a freely improvised performance, and the stamina that was witnessed there. It was that really left a mark on me in terms of the through line and the stamina and sort of patience. So I remember that concert to this day as something that was pretty profound. And I think probably other early concerts, I'm sure seeing them a few times, but definitely I remember coming to New York to see Dave Holland's quintet when Steve Coleman was in the band, and Kevin Eubanks, I think, at that point. And that was like, I had met Steve and started studying with him, and so I was very eager to sort of know what they were doing musically. And it was just, I remember it was at the old knitting factory, and I remember seeing that show and kind of being completely blown away. A bunch of my friends, I was living in Montreal at the time, and so a bunch of us drove down to New York to see that concert. And, I think we drove back that night afterwards, but we were just wired from the experience.
That gives me a good tapestry there for sure. There's so much that's gone into your career up to this point. There's so many things, so many commissions, so many arcs, and so many things that have happened. My question generically is this: are you happy with where you're at with your career and where things are going to go from here?
Yeah, this is actually an exciting time. I mean, it's interesting when from someone on the outside looking, going, "Oh, well, there's all these wonderful, landmarks or moments to celebrate." And it's I don't tend to document the challenges or document the disappointments, right? But there's, if I look at it from my perspective, and I see both sides of my life in terms of what I've been able to do and what I haven't been able to do. And some of those things that I haven't been able to do, I'm still working out the kinks to either figure out how to do them or refashioning them to find more efficient ways or more workable ways, artistically or logistically. And then the other things are things that I didn't do because maybe something that that's attributed to my own limitation or just a blind spot that I wasn't able to see my way through a situation, and so that my own failings, if you will. And it's interesting because those things, nobody knows about those things because they're not talked about, but they still impact the sort of trajectory. I did a chapter in someone's colleague's book. It was basically, I didn't write the chapter, but they wrote the chapter about me, and it was talking about failure, and the ideas of how failure is a kind of important stage and in developer of anything. And if you talk to any scientist or any developer of software, any really sort of like, endeavor of something new, failure is a big piece of it, And so these areas in which I haven't, something hasn't worked, it's still sort of a building block for the next thing that does work, that you do talk about, And I think for me, it's like I'm happy with where things are. I think I have to get up every day and kind of keep soldiering on because there's lots of disappointment. I mean, even this morning before we spoke, I had the fire I had to put out that was like, oh, this was just like, there's all these little moments where you're constantly being tested to see if your resolve is intact. And I guess the thing is, like, we hope we live long enough to see through our grandest ambitions and have the kind of vitality to our work that we envision developing. Because sometimes we don't necessarily know precisely that you can have a general picture of something, but you can't see it through with clarity until you see it through with clarity, and you can't always get that opportunity until certain things are in alignment.
I want to know this, and I know I made this. It wasn't necessarily a mistake, but it was a wording choice with Steve Coleman. I interviewed him, and I asked him why he loved jazz, and the term jazz is not something specifically that you want to pigeonhole this genre into, but I guess I asked generically because of the fact that we are specifically catering to the idiom of jazz on our station. My question to you is this: why do you love improvised music or jazz, or however you want to term that?
I love improvised music precisely because it is allowing the performer, and I think, and that's interesting that we can sort of dance around the terminology, but it's allowing the performer the ability to, contribute and, make statements in that moment. And it's vital, and it's in terms of having vitality. It's like having a conversation. It's as important as a random conversation at the water cooler, or a random conversation walking down the street. Or at a dinner table, or you go to a conference. Like these kinds of settings where you strike up a dialogue and something new is able to sort of be given, life to. And I think improvised music in many forms, not just in the forms that we maybe closely associate with jazz and the jazz universe, because this improvisation exists in other forms of music. In fact, classical music had more improvisation until, only the last 100 years, really. Classical performers were fabulous improvisers. So I think the idea of improvisation being jazz having a lockout on that is it's a bit askew in terms of the reality of totality of music. But I love improvised music because it really gives rise to this sort of moment of the now, and the sort of whole tradition that is kind of wrapped up in expressing the now, but also maybe there are compositional elements that then are more time-honored way of constructing ideas that at least steer people in ideas to say, hey, let's talk about this. And then it's sort of presented with some options that you're going to talk about, but there may be some parameters. And so there's a little bit of room for everyone in a way. So there's an opportunity for, I guess, a democratic kind of dialogue, whereas perhaps there's less of that in musical areas where everything is to be presented precisely as the composer intended.
So my final question to you is this. Everyone has a perception of who you are, your family, your friends, your fans, your colleagues, but you know who you are. Tell me, who do you think you are?
I think I'm the eternal optimist who's constantly questing for the better pathway. I'm always looking to recycle and optimize.
I like that. That's a great answer. It's a great way to wrap everything up. Andy, thank you for taking some time out. I really appreciate you giving me your time, and we had some bumps here, but everything worked out. Man, thank you very much.
Good. Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for your interest in it, too.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview. where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Andy for his time, his music, and his stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.